to continue with 3D modeling, what we're going to do now for this week is we're going to learn how to render it using materials and lighting, and render it into images that are going to look a little bit more realistic than the shading that the model comes with when we first start to work on it in Autocad and build the model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a model that I was working on some years ago to make a piece for one of my relatives for a holiday or something. I can't recall. But what it was is essentially it was a model of a clock that I'd put together, and this was the base of the clock. And essentially what I had done is I had gotten it laser cut, and I constructed it, and I got all the mechanisms for making the clock, and turned it into a clock for a gift. So just so you see that in the end, this is actually what it turned into. And this is the 3D model that I'm opening up right now, and it's a little big, so it's going to take a little bit to open up. But this is what it is, and it was essentially a bunch of layers that I had designed specifically in Photoshop. And you know, just as an aside, you can start to work with programs such as Photoshop and Illustrator, and you can bring them into AutoCAD, and you can start to build models with them. So that's just an extra, you know, layer of using 3D modeling in AutoCAD, but you can create things that look like this. Now, as I said, what I want to do is when I start to work with my 3D model, I want to just make sure, you know, personally for me, I like to start using the 3D modeling workspace, okay? And that's because I have all of the materials and commands that I need, you know, right there, and you know, it's easy for me to access the commands that I need in order to continue on with this process. So when we render with any program, not only AutoCAD but any other 3D program, what we do is we actually go through a process called rendering, and what that does is it makes our model into an image, okay? You know, yes, it might look like I could take a screenshot, do something like this, and start to work with it, but the true way of rendering in any 3D program is to actually go through this rendering process, adding materials, adding lights, adding, you know, anything like that in order to make it a little bit more realistic, and then taking that and rendering it to an image file. So to do that, if I go into my render ribbon, you'll see that these are all the commands that we're going to be working with. If I type in the command render, okay, that will automatically bring up the render window, which is the window in which we render our image. Okay, so you'll see that it's going through a process of it. Now I have mine set pretty high, okay, so it's going to take a little bit. If you find that your rendering is taking a little bit, you can always hit escape to get out of it. Okay, so I can hit escape and it'll cancel it. Okay, but what I want to do is I actually want to render that image. So I'm going to type in render again, and it's going to render the view, and we'll just wait for a second for it to pop up. And you'll see that as it starts to render, it does it in little bits. Okay, and the more complex the project is, the more it's going to go through iterations and iterations and iterations. So you might find that it'll come through with all these bits, and then it'll do another pass through it, do it again, and do it again, and do it again, depending on how complex the model is. Typically with models, the more reflective surfaces you have, the more water that you have, the more glass that you have, the longer it's going to take. So it's not uncommon for these models, you know, if you're doing a big interior space, if you're doing a big model, to take hours to do. Okay, for our scale, it really shouldn't take that long, but you'll find, if you haven't found already, that people will sit in the computer lab for hours and render. Okay, so it's not a fast process once you really start to add a lot of information to it. Now, once I have my rendering, okay, this is my render window that pops up. If I want to save my rendering, okay, all I have to do is go down to my list. Okay, so you'll see that basically right here in this window, there's a window that shows our model. It shows us our output file name. So what it does is it automatically names our file for us and keeps a record of it. It gives us the size, which we can change, and I'll show you how to do that. It shows you the view that we're rendering, how long it took, and the preset. To save our iteration, okay, if this isn't our final image, if I right-click on the name of the output file name, you'll see that it gives me a series of options. Render again, save copy, make render settings current, so on and so forth. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on save, and it's going to now kick me into a folder where I can save that image. Okay, and you'll see that I can save it as different image formats too as well. There's a bitmap, the target, the TIFF, and even the PNG and the JPEG are the most common. Basically, in my experience, bitmaps and TIFFs are a lot more, they're a lot better quality image, okay? PNGs work with Fireworks, okay, which is an Adobe program, and you'll find that JPEGs, I always call them the utilitarian file, okay? They're really quick, they're really easy, they're really small, which, you know, is great when you're starting to work with it, but it's, you know, they tend not to show up with the best quality. So what I usually do is when I start to work with my final presentations, I'll either use a bitmap or I use a TIFF, most commonly a TIFF. But again, with that comes the larger file size. So I'm going to name this iteration 1 because it's not going to be my final, it's just an iteration. And I'm going to save, let's just save it as a JPEG. Okay, even though I said I use TIFFs for final presentation, if this is just really quick and easy, I'm just going to use it as, or save it as a JPEG. Okay, you'll see that it gives me my image options, and I'll hit OK. And what that does is it saves it as an iteration, and you'll see that now it'll change the output file name. Okay, so if I actually change that file name, it will change that for me in the list. And what's nice about Autocad and its rendering is that every time I take a rendering and every time it completes, it'll actually keep a record of it. So if I ever need to go back into the list and say, oh, you know what, I wanted that one, I can, as long as I don't close out the program, I can open this up, I can right click on that one iteration, and I can save it. Okay, so once I'm done with this, I can close out of this. Now you'll find that mine took a little long, okay, and that's because I had it set up for presentation format. And what I can do is I can actually change those settings in my render options, okay, up here under my render window, and I can set it up so that it's more of an iterative process. So you'll see that if I click on this tea kettle, now the tea kettle is what you'll see in every 3D program. The history of it is that that was the first thing to be 3D modeled and 3D rendered. So that you'll see that with Max, with Maya, with any 3D program, they always use this tea kettle, okay, as the icon for rendering. So you'll see that across all those different programs. So it should be easy for you to figure out where you're going to render, you know, and where you click to render your scene. So if I click on this, it'll run me through the rendering window again. And again, here you'll see the list that pops up when we start to render and render and render as long as we're in the program. I'm going to cancel this, so I'm going to hit escape. And you'll see that there's also a drop down. If I don't want to render the whole scene, but I want to render a little bit, okay, there's this option called render region. And I'm going to click on that. And in my model space, I'm just going to define a window. And you'll see that it doesn't go through the whole render window, but what it does is it actually renders it within my model space. Okay, just giving me a really, you know, quick, theoretically quick, okay, I still have mine set on a high setting, but it should just give you a quick little preview of what it's going to look like if you actually went through the whole thing. So rather than taking hours in rendering a scene and then finding out that something's wrong with it, okay, you can just do it a portion of it really quickly, and then you can decide whether or not to go from there. To get rid of this, you can, you know, just move and it'll disappear. Okay, and you'll see that up here are where we set our render presets. So our presets here, I have medium. I can click on manage render presets. Okay, and you know, there's some more advanced presets here if you want to get into those. If I cancel out of that and I expand this window, okay, I can essentially just adjust the quality here. Okay, so if I say, well, I don't really want a higher quality, I can use your slide rule to slide that. I can make it a greater quality, okay, by bringing it all the way to the right. I can change the size of it. So what this does is it actually affects the physical size of it. This is the size of it in pixels. So not only do you have to worry about the quality of it, okay, which is the resolution, which is the DPI of it, okay, the dots per inch, but you also have to worry about the size of it, because if I have a very high quality image and it's really tiny in size and I go to change the scale of it, okay, it's going to end up being pixelated. So there's two things when we start to render that we have to be aware of. Okay, one is physical size and one is the quality of it. It's always easy to go from big to small than it is to go from small to large, because what it does is it physically stretches out those pixels, making it look really pixelated. Okay, and so that's where you can start to work with your rendering of your model. Okay, I just clicked on this little arrow here to show that there's some other options here too as well. Once you start to get into it, you can start to change this, but as a beginner, you can just leave this alone and just work with these settings here in order to get the result that you want.